Hello, good afternoon. We are here at the Sewing Labs at the Gratitude and Grace Quilt Retreat, and many of you are joining us online and by Facebook Live, and we love that. And we're going to do a lesson right now on how to create infinity binding, which is a binding that, if I show you this quilt, this is an infinity binding where it's the exact size when you get done, and because it's on a bias, it creates less bulk in comparison to just an overlap binding like this, where you have a lot of bulk right there at the seam. So I'm going to show you how to do an infinity binding so that when you get done putting your binding on your quilt, it fits your quilt exactly right. The first thing you're going to do is cut strips of binding, and the way that I do mine, and this is the way I was taught by a quilter years ago, is I cut my strips 2.5 inches wide, and I cut it the width of the fabric. I do not cut it on a bias. That saves me a lot of fabric, and I do not have any problem with it puckering or torquing on me. And that also allows me to do what I call mock mitered corners. So these are mock mitered corners. So they almost look like I've done a little seam on the corner, but it's a way you fold it so that they come out to be a mock mitered corner. So out of my fabric, I cut a 2.5 inch wide strip. And then to join this 2.5 inch wide strip, I'm going to join it with a diagonal seam, because that spreads out the bulk, and so you don't have it stacked on top of each other, and that allows me to do that. Now, basically I'm taking the two ends of the fabric, laying one right side up, laying the other one at a 45-degree angle right side down, and you can take a ruler. I'm going to take this small one, and you can be really scientific about this or not. You can take a ruler, and from this point to this point, I'm right-handed, this will be tricky. You can draw a line for your stitch line. Sometimes I eyeball it. You can also take a ruler like this that has a 45-degree line on it, and you can lay the ruler with this edge along the straight edge of the binding, put the 45-degree line across the middle. It shows you where it's going to go, and then you really just alternate. I hate doing this because I never do it. That this line is here, and see if I'm on this 45-degree line right here, it's creating a perfect 45-degree triangle right there for you to draw a line across. So after I draw the line, I stitch it like this. I come back and I trim down to the seam allowance, and I'm going to press it open. Press it flat. I don't have to press this open. I can press this to one side, and then I have all my strips together. Now, how I determine my strips, this is my fake quilt, so no, this is not a pretty beautiful quilt. It's just a piece of pre-quilted fabric, but this is good for just showing you how to do it. You're going to measure the perimeter of your quilt after you've trimmed it down and squared it up, because you want to make sure it's the correct size. And then I'm going to add about 15 to 20 inches to that measurement, and you'll see why in a minute. But after you've made your quilt, after you've quilted your quilt, after you've squared it up, then you're coming down and you're going to measure the perimeter of your quilt. That's how you know how much binding you have to make. So you have to do a little bit of math and cut how much binding you want to make. After you sew it together, you're going to take it to the ironing machine. That's good. You take it to the iron. You're going to fold it in half lengthwise and press it. I have always folded my binding and doubled it, because to me, one of the first things that wears out on a quilt is the edges of the quilt from use. And so by me having this folded in half, I have 2 layers of fabric that are going to last a lot longer on a quilt. Now, at the beginning, I told you guys to cut this about 15 to 20 inches longer than the perimeter of your quilt. And the reason for that is when you start to put this binding on your quilt, I want you to leave like 10 inches at the beginning. And I always start in the middle bottom of my quilt, because that way, even when you seam it, it's the bottom of your quilt, and hopefully people don't really look at it really heavy. And you're going to just leave your 10-inch tail, put your raw edge to raw edge, and you're going to start by pinning it to the middle center of your quilt. And another trick is I don't pin my binding all the way around as I sew, before I sew, because it moves. You have to just go as you go. So you're going to start here, you're going to back stitch here, you're going to sew to the corner, you're going to fold your mitered corner, and you're going to continue to sew. Don't pin the whole thing on because it's going to move on you. So we're going to flip over here to this one that I already have sewn on and pinned around. And so as you can see, I have my 10-inch tail. I've sewn it all the way around. I come to the other end. Now I have a little extra on here, and I'd rather have too much than too little, let me tell you. So here's the tricky part about mitered corners infinity binding, is the fact that it's like, how do you know how much to leave, and how do you know how much that's going to make it be exactly the right measurement when you get done? Well, the trick is you want to find and you want to overlap these two ends, and whatever this width is, this width here, and for me it's 2.5 inches, that's the exact measurement of your overlap, okay? So I'm going to take this one and I'm just going to cut it off. And I left myself unsewed about 10 to 12 inches because you need that room in order to manipulate that. You'll see this in a minute. So I cut this one off. So that means this one is going to overlap, and I'll do it this way so you can see it better, 2.5 inches. Okay? So here's the end of this one. I'm going to measure 2.5. See, here's 1, 2.5. Right there's the end of it. Okay? Now, if you want to, you can take your marking tool. Thank you, Miss Laura. And you can draw a line. And I know that's exactly where I'm going to cut that off at. Oh, I did the wrong one, but that's okay. It's right here. 2.5. Okay. But here's the part that always messes people up, and sometimes it still messes me up. I have a left one and I have a right one, right? I'm going to take the left one.
This is the hardest part.
This is the hardest part.
Yep.
I'm going to take the left one, I'm going to open it right side up. I'm going to take the right one and I'm going to twist it and lay it right side down. But see, here's why I need that extra fabric. And see how this has a corner? And this has a corner like this. So it's just like at the beginning where we sewed this together at a diagonal. We're doing that again. This is the hardest part. So again, I'm going to show you one more time. This one, I'm going to open up flat, right side up. This one was laying like this. I'm going to twist it. And I'm going to put it on the diagonal. And I'm going to lay it corner to corner. And the first thing I'm going to do is going to pin that up here so this edge matches, so that it stays in place while I do the next step. Okay, so here's what it looks like. This one's flat. This one's flat. Okay? Now, I'm going to sew a bias seam just like I did on this seam. So, the best thing you can do is go this corner to this corner that's hidden underneath. Draw a line with your marking pen. And I know my hand's in the way a little bit, so let me get it marked and then I'll show you. Draw a line corner to corner. See that line? Now I'm going to transfer my pins, or actually I may just use another set of pins while I'm showing you to make your life a little easier here. And I'm going to pin that seam in place so it doesn't shift while I'm sewing. Now I can take these two pins out. Okay, so now it's pinned because I'm going to stitch right across that chalk line. Make sense so far? Okay, yes. So now we're going to come to the machine and I'm going to sew, and I'm going to back stitch because this is my binding. When you're doing the outside of your quilt, you're to the point where you got to start back stitching everything on your quilt because there's nothing else that's going to intersect with this that's going to make it hold together. So you got to make sure that you're doing a back stitch. Okay, now I'm going to follow that line, which is probably harder to see. Let me draw it again with a blue marker a little bit so you can see it on TV. And I'm going to stitch corner to corner. I sure hope this comes out right while I have you on live. Corner to corner. seam up, trim. Now, I'm going to tell you, before I cut this corner off, and I'm going to do this because I don't know how many times I've done this backwards and I've messed it. Before I cut that seam allowance off, I'm going to pull these two ends and go, yay! It's perfect. See how there's no extra binding or anything? See, now I can go back in here.
That is the magic moment.
That's the magic moment, Robert. You got it. I'm going to turn this off. And now I should be able to just pin that down and finish sewing. And then I'm ready to flip it over to the front side and finish binding my quilt. And that's how you do an infinity binding. There are magic tools for it out there, but I've just learned how to do it mathematically. So makes it real easy to do. So thanks for stopping in and doing infinity binding with me today at the Sewing Labs. Have a great afternoon.